Avoidants don't play mind games to manipulate you. They play them to protect the one thing they're terrified to lose, you. If they retreat after intimacy, it's not rejection, it's panic. Avoidants don't pull back because the moment wasn't meaningful. They pull back because it was. To an avoidant, closeness is a double edged sword, the thing they crave the most, and the thing their nervous system is the least prepared to handle. When intimacy deepens after a vulnerable conversation, a warm weekend together, a night where they actually let themselves relax into you, their internal alarms begin ringing, not softly, loudly. Their brain starts telling them, this is too close, too dangerous, too exposed. And before their heart can convince them to stay, their survival system convinces them to run. This is where most people misinterpret the entire dynamic. They assume the avoidant pulled back because they lost interest, got bored, or were using the connection the whole time. But the truth is harsher, sadder, and more psychologically complex. Avoidants don't retreat from indifference. They retreat from intensity. They retreat from the moments that feel like they could change them. They retreat from the emotional openings that feel big enough to break something inside them or heal it. Both possibilities terrify them. When the connection gets good, really good, the avoidant suddenly feels like they're walking into a spotlight they never agreed to stand under. They become hyper aware of their own feelings, your feelings, and the weight of the closeness around them. And because vulnerability never felt safe for them growing up, their body reacts as if this intimacy is a threat, so they run, or they freeze, or they become oddly distant, quiet, or inconsistent, not because they want distance, but because they need time to regulate the tidal wave of emotion they're suddenly drowning in. For someone securely attached, connection feels grounding. For an avoidant, connection feels like a wave that could sweep them away if they don't grip onto something, usually their independence. So their instinct is to pull back to regain control, emotional control, mental control, relational control. They need to feel like they're back on solid ground before they can come closer again. And here's the twist. Pulling back is their way of staying connected. Sounds contradictory, but avoidants genuinely believe distance keeps the relationship safer, not just for them, but for you. They fear that if they stay close while feeling overwhelmed, they might lash out, shut down, or disappoint you. The irony is heartbreaking. They protect the connection by leaving it temporarily. So, what do you do when an avoidant pulls back right after the best moment you've had with them? You do the one thing they're silently praying you'll do. You stay calm, not cold, not punishing, not chasing, just calm. When you don't spiral, panic, or pressure them, you send a signal their nervous system isn't used to receiving. Closeness doesn't have to cost me anything. I'm safe here. Your regulated energy gives them time for their fear to settle and their attachment to surface again. They come back not because you chased, but because your steadiness made the return feel possible. Avoidants don't respond to pressure. They respond to emotional stability. They don't return to intensity. They return to safety. And the moment you show them that you won't punish their coping mechanism, their fear starts loosening its grip. Because underneath the retreat, the silence, and the sudden shift in energy, there's one truth they hope you never forget. They pulled back because the connection mattered, not because it didn't. Their coldness isn't distance, it's surveillance. Avoidance don't become detached because they stop caring. They become detached because caring makes them hypervigilant. When an avoidant suddenly shifts their tone, their warmth, or their presence, it's rarely about losing interest. It's about observing you, studying you, trying to understand whether the closeness between you is stable or whether it will erupt the moment they reveal too much. Their emotional cooling isn't passive. It is highly intentional. Even if they aren't consciously aware, they're doing it. Detachment becomes a protective mechanism wrapped in a psychological experiment. They pull back, not to abandon the connection, but to gather data. Will you get angry? Will you chase? Will you guilt trip them? Will you demand reassurance? Or will you stay grounded enough for them to feel safe returning? Avoidants live in a world where emotional closeness has historically been unpredictable. They grew up learning that affection disappears. Love shifts moods without warning, and vulnerability often leads to disappointment. So when things become emotionally charged in a relationship, even in a good way, their instinct is to cool the energy down, not because they want distance, but because they need to know the relationship doesn't depend on intensity to survive. Their coldness becomes a subtle test. Can this connection stay standing even when I'm not overflowing with reassurance? This is the avoidant's deepest fear, that love requires constant performance, that they have to be emotionally on 24/7, that if they slip for even a moment, the relationship will collapse and they'll be blamed for it. Their detachment is a way of asking the question they're too afraid to say out loud: is your love stable even when I'm not? So when they pull back, become quiet, or act indifferent, they're not pushing you away, they're watching. They notice how quickly your mood changes. They notice if you mirror their distance or punish them for it. They notice if you try to force closeness back into the space they created. Avoidants are far more perceptive than people give them credit for. Their emotional radar is always scanning for safety cues. They want to know whether you can regulate your own emotional weather or whether you rely on them to keep the relationship coherent. And here's the part no one talks about. Avoidants admire emotional calmness more than affection, more than closeness, more than intensity. Because calmness tells them one thing: they desperately need to know that your connection is grounded, that your love is not fragile, that their small withdrawal doesn't send you spiraling, that you aren't waiting for the smallest shift to accuse, chase, panic, or assume the worst. When they act detached, what they're seeking is emotional evidence. If I cool down, will you stay warm? If I create space, will you still be steady? If I retreat, will you explode? They don't want chaos. They want proof. So how do you outsmart this mind game? You match calm with calm. You let their emotional cooling wash over you without changing your tone, your energy, or your sense of security. You don't chase their reassurance. You don't mirror their disappearance. You don't make their silence about your worth. Instead, you show them silently, powerfully, that your emotional world doesn't collapse when theirs contracts. And something remarkable happens. They relax. Your calmness soothes their fear that closeness will cost them too much. Your steadiness signals that you're not dependent on their emotional temperature. Your groundedness becomes the lighthouse that guides them back without pressure. And for an avoidant, that's everything. Because deep down, their detachment isn't testing your feelings, it's testing your safety. And when you pass that test, they don't just come back closer. They come back, trusting you in a way they rarely trust anyone. An avoidant's strongest attachment always shows up as indifference. Avoidants don't hide their attachment because they're cold, they hide it because the feelings are too big for them to hold in the open. When an avoidant starts caring deeply, something paradoxical happens inside them. The more emotionally invested they become, the harder they work to look emotionally unaffected. Their indifference is not a lack of feeling, it's a shield built for survival. To an avoidant, needing someone feels like stepping into a battlefield without armor. It feels reckless, dangerous, exposed. So instead of showing how much they think about you, miss you, or rely on you, they do the exact opposite. They posture. They act uninterested. They pull off that calm, detached, I'm good either way persona as if their life depends on it. And the heartbreaking truth is, in their mind, it does. Avoidance grew up learning that needing people always had a cost. Disappointment, inconsistency, abandonment, our emotional invasiveness. So they train themselves to rely on no one, to show nothing, to depend only on their own inner world. Needing someone now feels like betraying the childhood promise they made to themselves. I'll never let anyone have the power to hurt me again. So when you come along, someone they feel safe with, someone who touches a part of them they thought was long dead, they panic. Not the kind of panic you see, the quiet panic. The kind that looks like emotional distance, dry responses, delayed replies, and an absurd commitment to pretending they're completely unaffected by you. Their strongest attachment hides behind their strongest performance. And ironically, the more obsessed they become, the more indifferent they appear. They won't tell you they replay your last conversation. They won't show you that they notice tiny details about you. They won't admit that they check your socials, reread your messages, or mentally orbit your presence. They'll pretend you're just another person in their world, but their nervous system reacts like you're a threat and a lifeline at the same time. This is why avoidants are so confusing. Their behavior contradicts their feelings. Their silence hides longing. Their indifference hides devotion. Their distance hides fear. Their nonchalance hides obsession. And you're left wondering why someone who seems so detached keeps coming back, why someone who doesn't care never fully leaves, why someone who looks unaffected acts differently than they feel. So, how do you outsmart this emotional disguise? You don't take the mask personally. You stop assuming their calmness is the truth. You stop reading their neutrality as apathy. You stop interpreting their stoicism as lack of interest. Because the avoidant mask isn't about you, it's about their old wounds, their old fears, their old training. Under that mask is a person who cares far more than they will ever admit out loud, at least in the beginning. Eventually, their actions will give them away. They'll remember details you didn't think they were listening to. They'll show up in small but consistent ways. They'll make room for you even when they claim they don't need anyone. They'll circle back after disappearing, not because they're confused, but because their attachment always leads them home. Avoidants don't reveal love through words. They reveal it through contradictions, through the moments they break their own patterns, through the times they choose connection, even when it scares them. Their mask will slip. Their guard will falter. Their indifference will crack. And when it does, you'll see the truth they've been hiding from you and from themselves. They never pretended they didn't need you because you didn't matter. They pretended because you mattered too much. Mixed signals aren't confusion, they're emotional breaks. Avoidants don't send mixed signals because they're unsure of what they want. They send mixed signals because they're overwhelmed by how intensely they want it. When an avoidant starts developing real feelings, their pheromone system hits a red zone, not because the connection is wrong, but because it's waking up parts of them they've spent years keeping numb. And when that emotional intensity rises too fast, they instinctively press the brakes, not on the connection, but on their own feelings. Mixed signals are their attempt to stay in control of something that feels bigger than them. One moment they're warm, open, attentive, saying things that make you feel seen in a way no one else ever has. Their guard slips, their heart shows, and you think, this is it. They're finally letting themselves feel this. Then, without warning, the energy shifts. They become distant, the warmth disappears. They get vague, quiet, harder to read, and you're left confused, hurt, questioning everything. But here's the part most people miss. The warmth was real, and the withdrawal is also real. Both sides tell the truth. Avoidants live in a constant tug of war between desire and fear. Their hearts pull them toward you, but their nervous system pulls them away. When their feelings intensify too quickly, they feel like they're losing control, and losing control terrifies them far more than losing a person ever could. So they alternate between leaning in and leaning out as a way of pacing the emotional speed. They're not stringing you along. They're trying to slow themselves down enough to survive the vulnerability that comes with caring deeply. Mixed signals are not a sign of inconsistency. They're a sign of emotional overload. Avoidance grew up believing that closeness leads to suffocation or disappointment. So when they finally meet someone who feels emotionally significant, their system short circuits. They're not used to being this affected. They're not used to wanting someone this much. They're not used to feeling the gravitational pull of attachment this strongly. So they regulate the intensity in the only way they know how, by intermittently withdrawing. Withdrawal becomes their oxygen mask. Warmth becomes their confession. Distance becomes their reset button. Mixed signals become their survival strategy. Think of it like this. Their feelings accelerate faster than they can psychologically process. So the mixed signals are them trying to catch up with their own emotional truth. And here's the heartbreaking irony. The more an avoidant likes you, the more mixed their signals will be. Their panic doesn't come from indifference. It comes from investment. Their coldness doesn't come from a lack of care. It comes from too much care. Their inconsistency doesn't come from confusion. It comes from emotional flooding. So how do you outsmart this mind game? You stay consistent. Consistent energy is the antidote to their emotional turbulence. When you stay steady, not pushing, not pulling, not spiraling, their system slowly rewires. Your calm signals safety. Your reliability tells them the connection won't destabilize just because they momentarily did. Your grounded presence regulates the parts of them that were never shown what healthy closeness looks like. Consistency doesn't mean chasing. It doesn't mean over reassuring. It means holding a stable emotional frequency, even when they wobble in and out. When your energy stays steady, their fear slowly loses power. Their attachment begins to feel less like a threat and more like a home they can return to without drowning. Over time, the mixed signals quiet down. Their warmth lasts longer, their distance becomes shorter, their fear loosens, their trust strengthens. Because avoidants don't pull away to test your worth. They pull away to stabilize their own heart. And your consistency becomes the grounding force that teaches them love doesn't have to be chaos. Avoidants don't gaslight, they emotionally blur. Avoidants don't set out to manipulate your perception. They're not trying to twist reality or convince you that your feelings are invalid. What they're actually doing is protecting themselves from emotions they don't know how to handle. When things get emotionally charged, when you bring up a concern, express a need, ask for clarity, or try to talk about where the connection is going, the avoidant doesn't just feel confronted, they feel exposed. An exposure terrifies them more than conflict ever could. So they not because they're dishonest, but because honesty would require vulnerability. They're not ready to reveal. When you express how their distance hurts you, they might say, I didn't pull back, or you're reading too much into it. When you try to discuss emotional needs, they might shut down with, it's not a big deal, or why are we overthinking this? When you try to find clarity, they might deflect with, let's just relax, or you're too sensitive. These aren't attempts to confuse you, they're attempts to escape the emotional intensity that overwhelms them. If they blur the emotional moment, they don't have to fully feel it. Avoidants grew up in environments where their feelings either weren't mirrored, weren't taken seriously, or weren't safe to express. They learned early that the best way to survive was to disconnect from their own emotional reality. So when you bring an emotional truth to the table, especially if it involves how much they matter to you or how much their behavior affects you, it forces them to face feelings they've spent a lifetime suppressing. That's when the emotional blurring begins. They minimize to soften the emotional impact. They deflect to avoid the spotlight. They rationalize to replace feeling with logic. They withdraw to give themselves space to stabilize. They redirect the conversation so they don't have to sit in the discomfort of vulnerability. To you, it feels like self-doubt. To them, it feels like survival. And because avoidants rarely label their emotions clearly, even in their own minds, your emotional clarity can feel overwhelming. They don't know what they feel half the time. So when you come in with a sharp, honest expression of your experience, it's like shining a light into a room they've kept dark for years. Their instinct isn't to meet that light, it's to dim it. This is why avoidant communication often leaves you questioning yourself, not because they want to break your confidence, but because your emotional presence shines too brightly on feelings they've spent years trying to avoid. You're not being too much. You're simply speaking a language they were never taught how to understand. So how do you outsmart this dynamic? You name your feelings clearly but calmly. Avoidance shut down in the presence of emotional intensity, not emotional honesty. When you bring clarity without pressure, without accusation, without overwhelming emotion, you create a space where the avoidant can actually stay present. You turn the emotional moment into something they can digest, something they can sit with, something that doesn't feel like a threat. Say what you feel without raising the emotional temperature. Reveal without demanding. Share without flooding. Avoidants don't fear feelings. They fear emotional chaos. They fear not knowing how to respond. They fear being blamed for things they don't fully understand. They fear failing you. When you speak with calm clarity, you disarm the part of them that wants to blur. You make it safe for them to face their own emotions instead of hiding behind minimization. You show them that connection can survive discomfort and that feelings don't have to explode to matter. Over time, the blurring fades, the defensiveness softens, the avoidance loosens. Because clarity, spoken softly, teaches them something they were never taught. Feelings don't have to be feared, and neither do you. Avoidants don't gaslight, they emotionally blur. Avoidants don't set out to make you uncertain, insecure, or confused. In fact, confusion in you is just a side effect, not their goal. What they're actually trying to do is soften the emotional impact of the moment for themselves. When you bring a concern to them, when you ask for clarity, when you point out something that hurt you, they're suddenly pushed into emotional terrain that feels threatening. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because the conversation forces them to acknowledge feelings they've worked hard to bury. So instead of meeting your clarity with clarity, they respond with fog. They minimize what happened. It wasn't that serious. You're reading too much into it. They flatten the emotional weight. I didn't mean it like that. You're overthinking. They shift the spotlight away from themselves. I don't know why you're making this a thing, but let's not get dramatic. And suddenly, you are the one second guessing your reactions. Suddenly, you're wondering if maybe you did exaggerate, or maybe you should have stayed silent, or maybe you're the problem. That self doubt didn't come from manipulation, it came from their discomfort. They blurred the moment to escape it. Avoidants do this because they were never taught how to hold big emotions, not their own, and not anyone else's. Emotional honesty feels like exposure. Emotional responsibility feels like pressure. Emotional intimacy feels like a trap. When you come to them with something real, their nervous system interprets it as danger. Their defenses activate instantly, shut it down, reduce it, dilute it, dismiss it, not to protect the relationship, but to protect themselves from being overwhelmed. Inside, it sounds like, if I feel this too deeply, I'll lose control. If I acknowledge this, it means I care more than I want to admit. If I sit with this emotion, it might drown me. So they choose the only coping mechanism they trust, distance through distortion. They're not erasing the truth, they're softening it enough so they don't have to sit with the discomfort of recognizing just how much you matter. Because if they acknowledge it, they hurt you, then they must also acknowledge the depth of their attachment. And that level of vulnerability terrifies them more than the conflict itself. That's why their emotional blurring can feel so disorienting. You're not arguing with an uncaring person, you're arguing with someone terrified of what caring reveals. The tragedy is this: their emotions aren't too much, their skills are too few. Avoidants don't have the emotional vocabulary to navigate conflict safely. When you bring clarity, they feel cornered. When you bring depth, they feel exposed. When you bring truth, they feel overwhelmed. So they blur the edges of the moment, hoping it will soften enough for them to survive. But here's what actually works, and it's simpler than you think. You name your feelings clearly, but calmly. Avoidants don't shut down in the face of honesty. They shut down in the face of emotional overload. They don't fear the content of the conversation. They fear the intensity of it. When you speak with clarity instead of veet, the avoidant nervous system doesn't go into lockdown. When you explain what you feel without spiraling, they stay present instead of retreating. When you communicate without blame, they can actually hear you without falling apart inside. Calm clarity is the antidote to emotional blur. It gives them something they've never had: the ability to face emotions without being swallowed by them. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, they begin meeting you in the middle. They stop minimizing. They stop deflecting. They stop disappearing inside themselves. Because your clarity teaches them that emotions don't have to be frightening, and connection doesn't have to be something they run from. When an avoidant goes silent, it's never silence, it's fear speaking for them. Avoidants don't withdraw because they don't care. They withdraw because caring feels dangerous, especially when the connection is getting real. Silence becomes their safest hiding place. It's the one place where they can't say the wrong thing. They can't disappoint you. They can't be judged. They can't be vulnerable. And yet they can still keep one eye on you from the shadows. When an avoidant goes quiet, it's rarely indifference. It's monitoring. It's waiting. It's watching how you respond to the space they've created. Because that space, that's their test, intentional or not. This silence is not a shutdown. It's a survival tactic. Inside their mind, silence does three things. One, it gives them emotional control. If they stop talking, they no longer have to manage emotional tension or intimacy they aren't ready for. Two, it gives them breathing room. Avoidance needs space, like oxygen. When feelings intensify, silence feels like a temporary escape hatch. Three, it lets them see if you'll chase. Not because they want power, but because they want reassurance without having to ask for it. If you chase, they get proof you care. If you don't chase, they panic, but they won't show it. This creates the avoidant paradox. They go silent to feel safe, but the silence increases their fear of losing you. So they watch you from afar to see whether the connection is still alive. What they're really hoping for behind the silence, avoidants don't actually want the silence to be permanent. They just want to see whether the relationship is strong enough to survive the retreat. So they hope you'll still be there, still calm, still solid, still not angry, still not emotionally overwhelming. They want proof that coming back won't cost them their sense of self. But here's what they don't realize. Their silence often sends mixed signals. It can make you overthink, self-blame, or assume you've done something wrong. And this is where the mind game effect happens, even if they're not consciously intending it. How to outsmart it. Without playing the game, don't fill the silence with chasing. Not because you're trying to punish them, not because you're trying to mirror them, but because you're choosing stability over panic. When you respond to silence with steadiness, two internal switches flip inside the avoidant. Switch one. They're not trying to control me. Your calm, non-reactivity feels safer than emotional urgency. It shows them you're not trying to pull them closer than they can handle. Switch two. I can return without backlash. Avoidance fear that coming back will lead to conflict, interrogation, or emotional explosions. When that fear isn't there, they feel safe enough to re-engage. The power of your calm presence. Avoidants don't need chasing. They don't need pressure. They don't need emotional over-explanations. What they need is emotional grounding, someone who can hold their own without collapsing or clinging. And when you do that, their silence stops feeling like a prison and starts feeling like a pause they can come back from, a pause they can trust, a pause where love doesn't disappear just because the conversation did. Silence isn't the end for an avoidant. It's the moment they're silently asking, is it still safe to be connected to you, even when I'm scared? And when your steadiness answers yes, that's when they talk again. Avoidants don't play mind games to control you. They play them because loving you scares them more than losing you.